Why would a priest stop a father from leaving his own son's service and tell him to stay? Why would he say the container had been opened that morning, and why did that single sentence tighten my chest more than the service itself? What happened next forced me to stop mourning and start paying attention. Before we continue, we ask you to hit the hype button, subscribe, and like the video to help the channel grow. Tell us which city you are from in the comments. We would like to get to know our audience better. The church smelled like carnations and furniture polish. I sat in the third row, hands folded in my lap, watching the back of my son's casket. Oak, they'd told me. Brass handles. Like that mattered. Like I'd asked. People kept turning around to look at me, then quickly looking away when I met their eyes. I wasn't crying. I'd cried the night before, alone in my kitchen, staring at Evan's college acceptance letter still magneted to the refrigerator. But here, in front of everyone, I just felt hollow. The priest spoke about peace and rest and God's plan. Father Hart was a good man, I'd always thought so. But today his voice sounded distant, like he was reading from a script someone else had written. The words didn't land. They just floated above the pews, meaningless and formal. My colleagues from the university sat near the back. Dr. Patterson, head of our virology department, gave me a solemn nod when I'd walked in. A few grad students I'd mentored over the years were scattered throughout. They looked uncomfortable, like they weren't sure if they should be here or if their presence made things worse. I appreciated them coming, I did, but I also wished everyone would just leave. Evan was 19 years old. He'd called me 3 weeks ago, excited about a research opportunity. Something about marine biology, a summer internship he'd been hoping for. His voice had been so alive, so full of plans. Then, 5 days later, he'd collapsed during a pickup basketball game. Just collapsed. They'd rushed him to St. Augustine Hospital, 20 minutes from campus. By the time I got there, he was already in intensive care. Machines breathing for him, monitoring him, keeping him technically alive while his brain swelled and his organs began to fail. The doctor spoke to me slowly, using small words, like I couldn't possibly understand medical terminology. I'm a virologist. I've spent 23 years studying infectious disease transmission, immune response, cellular behavior. I understood exactly what they were saying. What I didn't understand was why it had happened. A healthy 19-year-old doesn't just collapse and spiral into multi-organ failure. There's always a cause. Always. But they kept saying it was just one of those things. A tragic anomaly. Sometimes the body just fails. Sometimes there's no explanation. I'd asked for tests. Specific tests. Toxicology panels, autoimmune markers, viral load screenings. They'd looked at me with pity and said they'd done everything they could. Everything standard, everything appropriate. Evan had lasted 4 days. 4 days of me sitting beside his bed, watching monitors, listening to the ventilator hiss and click. 4 days of nurses avoiding my questions and doctors patting my shoulder and telling me to prepare myself. On the 4th night, his heart stopped. They'd tried to restart it, failed, tried again, failed again, and then it was over. That was 11 days ago. Now I sat in a church, surrounded by people who barely knew him, listening to a priest describe a boy who sounded nothing like my son. Father Hart mentioned kindness and potential and community. He didn't mention that Evan had wanted to study jellyfish, that he'd been fascinated by bioluminescence since he was 7, that he'd once stayed up all night reading research papers about Cyanidarian neural networks, then explained them to me over breakfast with the kind of enthusiasm most kids reserved for video games. The service dragged on. Hymns I didn't know, prayers I didn't believe in, a eulogy from Evan's roommate that made me clench my jaw so hard my teeth ached. Finally, Father Hart gestured toward the casket and said something about eternal rest. People began to stand, shuffling toward the exits, murmuring condolences I couldn't quite hear. I stood too. I needed air. Needed to get out of this building, away from the flowers and the strangers and the oppressive weight of organized sympathy. I moved toward the side aisle, toward the door, my legs stiff from sitting too long. A hand caught my arm. Father Hart stood beside me, his grip firm but not aggressive. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed behind his glasses. He leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wait," he said. "Please. Just a moment." I stopped. People flowed past us, heading toward the parking lot, toward their cars, toward their normal lives. Father Hart didn't let go of my arm. He glanced toward the front of the church, where the pallbearers stood beside the casket, waiting. Then he looked back at me. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "In private." I followed him to the side vestry, a small room lined with robes and storage cabinets. He closed the door. The noise from the nave faded into muffled footsteps and distant voices. Father Hart turned to face me, his hands clasped in front of him like he was praying, or preparing. "The container was opened this morning," he said. I stared at him. "What?" "Before the service. It was opened." My chest tightened. "Why?" Father Hart shook his head. "I don't know. I wasn't told. But there were people here. Hospital personnel. They had documentation, authorization. They said it was procedural." "Procedural," I repeated. The word felt sharp in my mouth. "I thought you should know," Father Hart said. His voice wavered slightly. "I don't understand it either, but something about it felt wrong." I stood there, breathing carefully, trying to process what he'd just said. The container had been opened, after it had been sealed, after I'd signed the papers, made the arrangements, and agreed to everything they told me had to be done. Someone had opened it, that morning, without telling me. "Who authorized it?" I asked. "I don't know." "Did you see the paperwork?" "No, they showed it to the funeral director. He approved it." "On what grounds?" Father Hart hesitated. "I don't know, Nate. I'm sorry. I just thought you needed to know it happened." I looked at him for a long moment. He met my gaze, unflinching, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't expected. Concern, real concern, not pity, not sympathy. Just a quiet, steady worry that matched the tightness in my chest. "Thank you," I said. He nodded. "If you need anything, I know." I left the vestry and walked back into the nave. Most of the congregation had gone. A few stragglers lingered near the doors, talking in low voices. The pallbearers still stood beside the casket, their faces blank, their postures stiff. They looked like they were waiting for something, instructions maybe, or permission. I walked past them, out the front doors, into the parking lot. The sunlight was too bright, the air too warm. I got into my car, closed the door, and sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. The coffin had been opened. Why? I didn't go home. I drove without a destination, circling the familiar roads around St. Augustine, the same ones I'd taken while Evan was in the hospital, gas stations, strip malls, the turnoff to his old campus. Everything looked unchanged. I ended up at St. Augustine Hospital without meaning to. The glass building, spotless windows, plaques in the lobby. Best regional care 3 years running. I parked and watched the entrance. People came and went. Scrubs, wheelchairs, balloons, normal hospital life moving on. I thought about the night Evan's heart stopped. I'd been in the ICU waiting room when Dr. Reeves found me, calm, controlled. He said they'd done everything they could, that Evan's body had simply given up. I asked why. He said sometimes there's no answer. Undiagnosed conditions, tragic but not uncommon. Back then, I accepted it. You trust the system. Now I replayed the moment, the careful wording, the rehearsed tone, the way he looked past me, and I remembered something I'd dismissed. They'd called Evan's case resolved, not closed, resolved. I'd heard a nurse say it as I was leaving. Jossman case is resolved, transfer the file. It hadn't bothered me then. It did now. Resolved meant a decision. I opened my calendar. Weeks of canceled plans. One entry stood out. 2 days before Evan's heart stopped, I'd been scheduled to meet Dr. Patterson and the hospital's liaison about a joint research initiative, exactly the kind of collaboration I'd been pushing for. And now, sitting in that parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that the timing wasn't random. But the meeting had been canceled. Not by me, by the hospital. No explanation. Just a terse email from an assistant saying the meeting was postponed indefinitely. I stared at the calendar entry, my thumb hovering over it. Then I opened my email and scrolled back through the messages. Found the cancellation. Read it again. Due to unforeseen administrative priorities, we must postpone our scheduled meeting. We will reach out to reschedule at a later date. Thank you for your understanding. Unforeseen administrative priorities. I looked up at the hospital again. The glass doors slid open, closed, open, closed. People came and went. Life continued. I got out of the car. Inside, the lobby was bright and sterile. The smell of antiseptic mixed with coffee from the small cafe near the elevators. I walked to the information desk, where a young woman in a volunteer smock smiled at me automatically. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I need to access medical records," I said. "For my son, Evan Jossman." Her smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, her tone shifting to something rehearsed. "Records requests need to go through the medical records office. 3rd floor, East Wing." "Thank you." I took the elevator. 3rd floor, East Wing. The hallway was quieter here, less foot traffic. A sign pointed me toward the medical records office, a small suite with frosted glass doors. I pushed through and found myself in a cramped waiting area with 4 chairs and a reception desk. A clerk looked up from her computer. She was older, maybe 60, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck. "Can I help you?" "I need to request records for Evan Jossman," I said. "My son. He passed away 11 days ago." She typed something into her computer, her expression neutral. "I'll need you to fill out a request form. Do you have identification?" I handed her my driver's license. She made a copy, then gave me a clipboard with a 2-page form. I filled it out carefully, checking boxes, signing lines, specifying which records I wanted. All of them. Every test, every note, every scan. When I handed it back, she reviewed it briefly, then set it aside. "This will take a few days to process," she said. "We'll contact you when the records are ready for pickup." "How many days?" "Usually 3 to 5 business days." "That seems long." She glanced at me, her expression still neutral. "It's standard procedure. We have to review the request, ensure compliance, redact any protected information." "Protected information?" I said. "He's my son. I'm next of kin." "I understand," she said, her tone patient but firm. "But there are protocols, especially for cases that involve—" She trailed off. "Involve what?" I asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. "I'm sorry, I can't discuss specifics. You'll receive a call when the records are ready." I stood there for a moment, watching her return her attention to her computer. She didn't look up again, didn't acknowledge me. Just typed, her fingers moving steadily across the keyboard. I left. Back in the parking lot, I sat in my car again, hands gripping the steering wheel. My phone buzzed, a text from Dr. Patterson. "Thinking of you today. Let me know if you need anything." I stared at the message, then typed back, "Thanks. I'm fine." It was a lie. I wasn't fine. I hadn't been fine since the moment they told me Evan was gone. I'd been moving on autopilot, accepting explanations, trusting the system, but something didn't fit. I drove home to an empty, silent house. In the kitchen, I poured a glass of water and stared at the refrigerator. Evan's acceptance letter, his handwriting on a grocery list, a photo from his graduation. I opened my laptop and logged into the university's research database. Mortality protocols for young adults, case studies, guidelines, everything I already knew but needed to confirm. Healthy 19-year-olds don't just collapse into multi-organ failure. There's always a cause. Infection, toxin, congenital defect, autoimmune response. And when it happens, there's a protocol. Tests to run, variables to rule out. I thought about the tests I'd requested, the ones the doctors dismissed, the way they'd spoken to me, slowly, carefully, like I couldn't understand. My phone rang. Unknown number. "Dr. Jossman?" a man said. "Marlon Price, senior administrator at St. Augustine Hospital. I wanted to express my condolences." His voice was smooth, practiced. He offered support, asked me to reach out with questions. "I've requested my son's medical records," I said. There was a brief pause. "Of course," he replied. "I'll see if we can expedite that." He hung up before I could say more. I stared at the phone, then back at the protocols on my screen. Something was wrong, and I was going to find out what. The next morning, I went to work. Not because I felt ready, but because staying home felt worse. The virology lab was where things still made sense. Controlled variables, measurable outcomes. I arrived early. The building was quiet, filled only with the hum of ventilation and overnight equipment. My third-floor office was cluttered with journals and half-erased diagrams. I sat down and opened my email. 217 messages, condolences, work notes, grant updates I'd ignored. I scrolled without reading until one subject line stopped me, from Dr. Patterson. Joint Protocol Initiative. He expressed sympathy, told me to take my time, said the hospital liaison meeting had been postponed due to administrative restructuring. They'd reschedule when I was ready. That phrase again, vague, convenient. I opened the hospital's website and found the administration directory. Marlon Price, senior leadership, polished photo, long resume. Nothing unusual. Below that was a list of donors and advisory board members. I skimmed the names until one made me stop. Caleb Morris, my brother-in-law. Caleb, my sister's husband, real estate developer. Always talking leverage and relationships. I hadn't seen him in over a year, not since a tense Thanksgiving where he barely looked up from his phone. He was listed as a major donor, high on the advisory board, which meant influence, access, the ability to open doors and close questions. I closed the laptop and sat there, hands folded on the desk, thinking. A colleague knocked on my door. Dr. Lisa Brennan, one of the postdocs I supervised. She poked her head in, her expression cautious. "Nate," she said softly. "I didn't know you were back. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," I said automatically. She stepped inside, holding a folder. "I'm really sorry about Evan. If you need anything..." "I know. Thank you." She hesitated, then set the folder on my desk. "These are the sequencing results you asked for before everything. I finished them last week, but I didn't want to bother you." I picked up the folder and flipped through it. Data from a viral transmission study we'd been running. Clean, thorough, exactly what I'd expected. "This is good work," I said. "Thanks." She lingered for a moment, then added, "Dr. Patterson said you might not be back for a while. He's been covering your lectures." "I appreciate that." She nodded, then turned to leave. At the door, she stopped. "Nate? Yeah? There's something I wanted to mention. I don't know if it matters, but a couple weeks ago I ran into someone from St. Augustine Hospital, a lab tech. We were at a conference, and she mentioned they'd been dealing with some kind of internal audit, something about procedural compliance. She didn't give details, but she seemed stressed about it. I looked up. "When was this?" "Maybe 3 weeks ago, around the time you were supposed to meet with them about the joint initiative." I nodded slowly. "Thanks for telling me." She left, and I sat there, staring at the folder in my hands. An internal audit, procedural compliance. The same time my meeting was canceled, the same time Evan collapsed. I opened my laptop again and searched for St. Augustine Hospital's regulatory filings. Found their annual compliance reports, publicly available through the state health department. Skimmed through the most recent one. Everything looked standard, clean inspections, no major violations. Accreditation maintained. But buried in the appendices, I found a footnote. A single line noting a voluntary internal review initiated in response to procedural discrepancies identified during routine mortality audits. Voluntary internal review, procedural discrepancies, mortality audits. I read the line 3 more times, then pulled out my phone and called the medical records office at the hospital. The same clerk answered. "Medical records? How can I help you?" "This is Dr. Nate Josman. I submitted a records request yesterday. I'm calling to check on the status." "Let me pull that up." I heard typing. "Yes, Dr. Josman, your request is still being processed. It should be ready by the end of the week." "Can you tell me why it's taking so long?" "As I mentioned yesterday, we have protocols. Your son's case requires additional review." "Why?" She hesitated. "I'm not authorized to discuss that." "Who is authorized?" "You'd need to speak with the compliance office." "Transfer me." Another pause. "1 moment." The line clicked, then rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then voicemail. "You've reached the compliance office at St. Augustine Hospital. Please leave a message and we'll return your call within 2 business days." I hung up without leaving a message. Back at my desk, I pulled up the hospital's organizational chart and found the compliance office. The director was listed as Irene Voss. No photo, no bio, just a name and an extension. I called. 4 rings. Voicemail. I hung up again. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing medical protocols, not just hospital policy but federal guidelines, CDC recommendations, Joint Commission standards, everything governing unexpected deterioration, mortality reviews, and documentation. By lunch, I'd listed 32 procedural checkpoints that should have appeared in Evan's case. 32 moments where the right questions should have been asked, the right tests ordered, the cause identified, and then it clicked. If those checkpoints had been followed, I should have been consulted, not as a grieving father, but as next of kin with medical expertise. They were required to walk me through every decision, every test, every finding. It wasn't optional, it was protocol, it was the law. But they hadn't. They'd spoken to me in generalities, platitudes. They'd dismissed my questions and hurried me out of the ICU after Evan was gone. They'd treated me like an obstacle, not a participant. Why? My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Dr. Josman, this is Irene Voss from St. Augustine Compliance. I understand you've been trying to reach me. I'd like to speak with you in person, if possible. Are you available tomorrow morning?" I stared at the message, my pulse quickening. I typed back. "Yes." "What time?" Her response came immediately. 9 a.m., my office, 3rd floor, West Wing. "I'll be there." I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair. Across the hall, Lisa and another postdoc were debating a protocol adjustment. Normal academic noise, normal work, Nothing felt normal anymore. I searched my email for messages from Caleb, a few over the past year, polite, distant, congratulations on a paper, an invite to a charity event I hadn't attended. Nothing that mattered. But I remembered something Grace had said years ago when she'd first married him. How proud she was. How Caleb sat on boards, funded projects, made connections. She'd mentioned the hospital, how he'd helped finance a new pediatric wing, how the administrators respected him. Caleb had access, Caleb had influence. And Caleb had never liked me. It wasn't personal. Just incompatible worldviews. He saw me as an academic detached from reality. I saw him as someone who measured everything in money. We tolerated each other for Grace. Nothing more. I pulled up his contact info and stared at it. Then I closed the window. Not yet. First, I needed to understand what had really happened to Evan. Then I'd figure out who was responsible and why. The next morning, I arrived at St. Augustine Hospital at 8:45. Early, but not suspiciously so. I parked in the same visitor lot I'd used before and walked through the main entrance. The lobby was busier than last time, people queuing at the pharmacy window, families clustered near the elevators. I took the stairs to the third floor. The west wing was quieter than the east, fewer people, less traffic. The compliance office was at the end of a hallway lined with administrative doors. A small placard beside the entrance read, Irene Vos, Director of Compliance. I knocked twice. Come in, a woman's voice called. I pushed the door open. The office was compact, organized to the point of severity. Metal filing cabinets lined one wall. A single desk sat beneath a window overlooking the parking lot. Behind the desk sat a woman in her late 30s, dark hair pulled back, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She stood when I entered. Dr. Jossman, she said, extending a hand. Thank you for coming. Her handshake was firm, professional. She gestured to the chair across from her desk, and I sat. She remained standing for a moment, studying me with an intensity that felt deliberate. Then she sat as well, folding her hands on the desk. I'm sorry for your loss, she said. I understand you've been requesting your son's medical records. Yes? And you've encountered delays. 3 to 5 days was the estimate, I said. Which seems excessive. Irene nodded slowly. It is excessive. Normally, next of kin requests are processed within 48 hours. Your request has been flagged for additional review. By whom? She hesitated, then pulled a file from her desk drawer. She didn't open it, just set it in front of her, her hand resting on top. Before I answer that, I need to ask you something. Why are you requesting these records? Because he was my son, I said, and I want to understand what happened to him. You were present during his hospitalization. You spoke with his physicians. I did, and their explanations were insufficient. Irene's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. A flicker of acknowledgement, maybe, or caution. Insufficient how? They told me it was an anomaly, a tragic, unexplainable event. But I'm a virologist. I've spent my career studying disease progression, and nothing about Evan's case fits the pattern they described. She was quiet for a moment, her fingers tapping lightly on the file. What pattern do you think it fits? I don't know yet, I said. That's why I need the records. She looked at me for a long moment, then opened the file. Inside were photocopies of forms, charts, logs. She flipped through them slowly, her face unreadable. Your son's case was part of a mortality review, she said finally. Standard procedure for unexpected patient deterioration. The review was completed 6 days ago. What were the findings? The review concluded that all appropriate care was provided. No procedural errors were identified. Then why was my records request flagged? Irene closed the file. Because someone requested it be flagged. Who? She met my gaze directly. Marlon Price. I felt my jaw tighten. The senior administrator. Yes. On what grounds? He cited concerns about incomplete documentation. He wanted to ensure the records were thoroughly reviewed before release. Incomplete documentation, I repeated. What does that mean? Irene leaned back in her chair. It means there are gaps, missing entries, notes that were logged but not fully detailed. It's not uncommon in high acuity cases. Things move quickly. Sometimes documentation falls behind. But those gaps exist, I said, which means something wasn't recorded properly. Or something wasn't done properly, Irene said quietly. I stared at her. She held my gaze, her expression neutral, but her words deliberate. She was telling me something without saying it outright, confirming what I'd already suspected. What do you recommend I do? I asked. She hesitated, then stood and walked to the window, looked out at the parking lot below. Officially, I recommend you wait for the records to be released through the standard process. Unofficially, she turned back to me. I recommend you consult an attorney, someone who specializes in medical oversight. Not malpractice, not liability, just oversight. Someone who can review the records independently and identify whether protocols were followed. You think they weren't. She didn't answer. Just returned to her desk and slid the file back into the drawer. Your records request will be processed by the end of the week. I'll make sure of it. Thank you. I stood to leave. At the door, I stopped. One more question. The mortality review. Who conducted it? Irene looked at me, her expression unreadable. An internal review committee, chaired by Marlon Price. I left the office with my thoughts racing. Marlon Price had flagged my records request. He'd chaired the mortality review. He sat on the same advisory board as Caleb Morris. Same network, same access. In my car, engine off, I stared at the hospital entrance. Then I searched for medical oversight attorneys, chose a firm specializing in healthcare compliance, and booked a consultation for the next afternoon. Then I called Grace. She answered, already apologizing for missing the funeral. I cut her off. How involved is Caleb with St. Augustine Hospital? Silence. Then carefully, very. He funded the pediatric wing. He's on the board. He knows the senior administrators. Did he know Evan was hospitalized there? Of course. I told him. He said he'd make calls. My grip tightened. Did he? He said he did. He told me Evan was in good hands. Did he say who he talked to? No. Nate, why are you asking this? I closed my eyes. Because the coffin was opened the morning of the funeral. Silence. Someone from the hospital went to the church, I said. They had authorization. Why? She asked, shaken. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. She begged me not to turn it into a conspiracy. It can't get worse than this, I said, and hung up. I watched the hospital for a while, then went home. I poured a drink I didn't finish and opened my laptop. I started organizing. Timelines, names, decisions, every conversation, every delay. I built a spreadsheet, cross-referenced roles, mapped connections. By midnight, I had structure, not answers, just documentation and gaps. So many gaps. The law firm was downtown, on the 8th floor of a building I'd driven past 100 times but never entered. Whitman and Associates. The receptionist was polite, efficient. She led me to a conference room with a long table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The attorney arrived 5 minutes later. Her name was Julia Whitman, mid-50s, gray hair cut short, wearing a suit that looked expensive but not ostentatious. She shook my hand and sat across from me, setting a legal pad and pen on the table. Dr. Jossman, she said, I understand you're seeking consultation regarding medical oversight. Tell me what's going on. I walked her through it. Evan's collapse, his rapid deterioration, the vague explanations, the dismissed questions, the delayed records request, the opened coffin, the institutional connections between Caleb and the hospital administration. I spoke calmly, factually, laying out the timeline without editorializing. Julia took notes, her pen moving steadily across the pad. When I finished, she set the pen down and looked at me. First, she said, I'm very sorry for your loss. Second, I want to be clear about what I can and cannot do. I'm not a malpractice attorney. I don't litigate wrongful demise cases. What I do is review healthcare institutions for regulatory compliance. I identify whether protocols were followed, whether documentation is adequate, and whether oversight mechanisms functioned as intended. That's what I need, I said. She nodded. Based on what you've told me, there are several concerning elements. The delayed records release is a red flag. The involvement of a senior administrator in flagging your request is another. The opened coffin is highly unusual, and without proper authorization from next of kin, it could constitute a violation. What would justify opening it? Very few things. Typically, it would require a court order, a public health emergency, or documented consent from the family. Even then, there are strict protocols. I didn't consent. Then someone bypassed standard procedure, Julia said, which means either they had extraordinary authorization or they acted improperly. She flipped through her notes. The other element that concerns me is the timeline. Your meeting with the hospital was canceled around the same time your son collapsed. That could be coincidental, but given the institutional connections you've described, it warrants scrutiny. What do I do next? You wait for the records, she said. Once you have them, I'll review them. I'll compare the documentation to standard protocols, identify any deviations, and determine whether there's grounds for further action. If I find compliance failures, I can file a formal complaint with the state health department. That triggers an external audit, which the hospital cannot block or delay. How long does that take? Weeks, sometimes months. But it's thorough, and it's binding. I nodded slowly. And if they try to block the record's release? Then I'll file a motion to compel, but I don't think it'll come to that. The hospital knows delaying beyond their stated timeline would be indefensible. She stood, extending her hand. Get me those records, Dr. Josman, then we'll see what we're dealing with. I left the firm feeling steadier than I had in days, not because I had answers, but because I had a process, a framework, something that made sense in a world that had stopped making sense 2 weeks ago. I drove back to the university. My office felt smaller than usual, cluttered with papers I couldn't focus on. I logged into my email and found a message from Dr. Patterson. Nate, just checking in. Let me know if you need more time off. No pressure, I typed back. Thanks, I'm managing. Back to work tomorrow. I hit send, then opened a new browser tab and searched for Caleb's company. Morris Development Group. Found their website slick and professional. Photos of completed projects, commercial buildings, and residential complexes. A staff page with headshots and bios. Caleb's photo was front and center. Same confident expression I remembered from every family gathering. Same look that said he owned every room he walked into. I clicked on his bio. Education, career milestones, community involvement. And there, listed under board memberships, was St. Augustine Hospital Advisory Board. I opened another tab and searched for Marlon Price, found his LinkedIn profile. 23 years in healthcare administration. Previous positions at 3 other hospitals, all in senior management. Connections listed, 412. Mutual connections, 6. One of them was Caleb. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. Then I closed the laptop and sat in silence, listening to the hum of the building around me. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Dr. Josman, this is Marlon Price. I wanted to follow up on our previous conversation. I understand you've been in contact with our compliance office. I'd like to meet with you personally to address any concerns you might have. Would you be available later this week? I read the message twice, then I typed back. I'm available tomorrow afternoon, 2 p.m. His response came immediately. Perfect. I'll have my assistant send you the details. Thank you. I set the phone down and stared at it. He wanted to meet. Personally. Which meant he was worried. Which meant I was asking the right questions. I spent the rest of the afternoon at the lab, running routine equipment checks, reviewing grad student progress reports, doing the mundane tasks that kept the department running. It felt good to focus on something concrete, something I could control. That evening, I went home and sat in my kitchen, staring at Evan's acceptance letter on the refrigerator. The paper was starting to curl at the edges. I thought about taking it down, putting it away somewhere safe. But I couldn't bring myself to move it. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up the spreadsheet I'd been building, added Marlon's meeting request, noted the timing, cross-referenced it with Julia's comments about institutional defensiveness. Then I opened a new document and started writing, not conclusions, not accusations, just questions. Specific, targeted questions I wanted answered, about protocols, about authorization, about who made which decisions and when. By midnight, I had 37 questions, and I was going to ask every single one of them. I arrived at Marlon Price's office 15 minutes early. The administrative wing was on the 5th floor, tucked behind a maze of hallways that felt deliberately confusing. His assistant, a woman in her 20s with a practiced smile, offered me coffee and gestured toward a leather couch in the waiting area. Mr. Price is finishing up a call, she said. He'll be with you shortly. I sat and waited. The office was designed to impress, framed awards on the walls, photos of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, charity events, hospital expansions, everything carefully curated to project competence and community trust. After 10 minutes, the assistant stood. He's ready for you. Marlon's office was large, corner-positioned with windows on 2 walls. His desk was polished wood, mostly clear except for a computer monitor and a single file folder. He stood when I entered, extending his hand with a warm smile. Dr. Josman, he said, thank you for coming. Please sit. I shook his hand and sat in one of the chairs facing his desk. He settled into his own chair, leaning back slightly, relaxed, in control. I wanted to meet with you personally, he began, because I know this has been an incredibly difficult time. Losing a child is something no parent should endure. And I want you to know that we take every patient outcome seriously, especially when it involves someone so young. I said nothing, just watched him. He continued. I understand you've been requesting your son's medical records, and that there have been some delays. I want to apologize for that. We've been dealing with some administrative transitions, and your request got caught in the shuffle. That's on us. Administrative transitions, I repeated. Yes, we've been implementing new compliance protocols, updating our record-keeping systems. It's created some temporary bottlenecks, but I've personally ensured that your request will be processed by the end of this week. Irene Vos told me the same thing. Marlon nodded. Irene's excellent, very thorough. She's been helping us navigate these transitions. I leaned forward slightly. You flagged my records request. Why? His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. A slight stiffening. I wanted to ensure the records were complete. Your son's case was complex. Multi-system failure, rapid deterioration. The documentation needed to be thorough. Was it? We believe so, but we wanted to be certain before releasing it to you, out of respect. Respect, I said. Or liability? He paused, then smiled again. A professional, diplomatic smile. Dr. Jossman, I understand you're a scientist. You want answers. I respect that. But sometimes, even with the best care, outcomes are unpredictable. Medicine isn't an exact science. People respond differently to treatment. Variables interact in ways we can't always anticipate. I know that, I said. I'm not questioning whether medicine is perfect. I'm questioning whether protocols were followed. Marlon's smile faded slightly. All appropriate protocols were followed. We conducted a mortality review. The findings were clear. The findings concluded there were no errors. That's not the same as confirming protocols were followed. He was quiet for a moment, studying me. What exactly are you alleging, Dr. Jossman? I'm not alleging anything. I'm asking questions, and I'm noticing that every time I ask, I get vague reassurances instead of specific answers. Marlon leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. Let me be specific then. Your son received excellent care. The physicians who treated him are among the best in the region. Every decision made was in his best interest. And while I understand your grief is driving you to look for answers, sometimes the answer is simply that tragedy happens. The coffin was opened, I said. He blinked. What? The morning of the funeral. Someone from this hospital went to the church with authorization and opened my son's coffin. Why? Marlon's face went very still. I'm not aware of that. Then find out. We stared at each other across the desk. The air felt heavy, charged. He didn't look away, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Calculation, recalibration. I'll look into it, he said finally. If something like that occurred without proper authorization, it's a serious matter. It occurred, I said. The priest confirmed it. Marlon nodded slowly. I'll investigate, and I'll let you know what I find. I stood. I'll expect a call by the end of the week. He stood as well. You'll have it. I left his office and walked back through the maze of hallways. In the elevator, I leaned against the wall and breathed slowly. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from anger. Controlled, focused anger. Back in my car, I called Julia Whitman. This is Julia. It's Nate Jossman. I just met with Marlon Price. How did it go? He's covering something up. He tried to frame it as administrative delays and complexity, but when I mentioned the opened coffin, he shut down. Did he admit to it? He said he'd investigate, but he knew. I could see it. Julia was quiet for a moment. Be careful, Dr. Jossman. If they're protecting something, they'll push back hard. Make sure you document everything. Every conversation, every delay, every inconsistency. I am. Good. As soon as you get those records, bring them to me. We'll go through them line by line. Thank you. I hung up and sat in the parking lot, watching people enter and exit the hospital. Normal people with normal problems, broken bones, infections, routine surgeries. They trusted this place. They believed the system worked. Maybe it did, for most of them, but not for Evan. I drove to the university and went straight to Dr. Patterson's office. He was at his desk, reviewing a grant proposal. He looked up when I knocked. Nate, he said, surprised. Come in. How are you? I need to ask you something, I said, closing the door behind me. When the hospital canceled our liaison meeting, did they give you a reason? Patterson frowned. Just what I told you, administrative restructuring. Did you follow up? I tried. Left a message with their office. Never heard back. Did you think that was strange? He hesitated. A little, but I assumed they were dealing with internal issues. Why? I sat down across from him. I think the issues were related to Evan. Patterson's frown deepened. What do you mean? The timeline matches. The meeting was canceled 2 days before he collapsed. The hospital's been delaying my records request. The senior administrator flagged it personally, and someone opened Evan's coffin without my consent. Patterson stared at me. Nate, what are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything yet. I'm just noticing patterns. You think they did something to Evan? I think they're hiding something. Patterson leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. That's a serious accusation. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm investigating. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, If you need help, let me know, but be careful. Institutions like that have resources, lawyers, public relations. If you're wrong, they'll bury you. I'm not wrong, I said. I left his office and spent the rest of the afternoon in the lab, trying to focus on work. But my mind kept circling back to the same questions. Why open the coffin? What were they checking? What had they missed? By evening, I was exhausted. I drove home, poured another drink I didn't finish, and stared at the spreadsheet on my laptop. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Dr. Jossman, your records are ready for pickup. You can collect them tomorrow morning at the medical records office. Irene Voss. I stared at the message. Tomorrow. Finally, I typed back. Thank you. I'll be there at 9. Then I opened a new email and drafted a message to Julia Whitman. Records will be available tomorrow morning. I'll deliver them to your office by noon. I hit send. Then I sat back and closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the past 2 weeks pressing down on me. Grief, anger, exhaustion. But underneath it all, something else. Resolve. Whatever they were hiding, I was going to find it, and they were going to answer for it. The medical records office was empty when I arrived at 9. The same clerk from before looked up from her computer, her expression neutral. Dr. Jossman, she said, your records are ready. She handed me a thick manila envelope, sealed with tape. I signed a release form and took the envelope without opening it. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and stared at it for a moment. Then I set it on the passenger seat and drove straight to Julia Whitman's office. She was waiting for me in the same conference room as before. I handed her the envelope. She broke the seal carefully, methodically, and spread the contents across the table. Hundreds of pages, lab results, physician notes, nursing logs, scans, charts. This is going to take time, she said. At least a few days. I understand. She glanced at me. You're welcome to stay while I do an initial review, but it's going to be tedious. I'll stay. She nodded and began sorting the documents into categories. Chronological order, by type, by provider. I watched, occasionally handing her papers when she gestured. We worked in silence for over an hour. Finally, she stopped, set down a page, looked at me. This is wrong, she said. What? She held up a sheet. This is a toxicology report. Standard screening. It shows negative for all common substances. Alcohol, recreational compounds, prescription medications. So it's dated 2 days after your son was admitted. But according to the physician notes, the toxicology screen was ordered the day he arrived. Why would it take 2 days? I frowned. Lab delays? Not for a tox screen. That's a priority test. Results should be available within hours. She flipped through more pages. Here's another issue. The admission notes say your son presented with altered mental status and rapid heart rate. The standard protocol would be to run a comprehensive metabolic panel, cardiac enzymes, and an EKG, but the metabolic panel isn't here. It's missing? Either missing or never ordered. And if it was never ordered, that's a significant deviation. She continued reviewing, her frown deepening. After another 30 minutes, she compiled a list. 8 documentation gaps, 5 procedural deviations, 3 delayed tests. This isn't normal, she said. Even in a high acuity case, these kinds of omissions don't happen by accident. What do they mean? They mean someone either didn't follow protocol or they did follow protocol and then selectively documented it. Either way, it's a problem. I felt my chest tighten. What's the next step? Julia tapped her pen on the table. I need to cross-reference these findings with federal and state standards. Confirm that what I'm seeing actually constitutes a violation. Then I'll draft a formal complaint to the state health department. That'll trigger an external audit. How long? A week, maybe 2. And the hospital will be notified? Yes. They'll have an opportunity to respond. But if the audit confirms compliance failures, they'll face sanctions. Possibly fines. Possibly accreditation review. I nodded. Do it. She looked at me seriously. Once I file this, there's no going back. The hospital will know you're challenging them. They'll push back. Let them. Julia held my gaze for a moment, then nodded. All right, I'll start drafting the complaint today. I left her office and drove back to the university. My phone rang as I parked. Unknown number. Hello? Dr. Jossman, this is Caleb. I gripped the steering wheel. What do you want? I heard you've been causing problems at St. Augustine. Grace told me you're making accusations. I'm not making accusations. I'm asking questions. You're harassing the administration. Marlin called me. He's concerned. Of course he called you, I said. You're on the advisory board. Caleb's voice hardened. I helped fund that hospital. I've been involved with it for years, and I'm telling you, as family, you need to drop this. Drop what? Whatever conspiracy theory you're building. Evan got sick. It's tragic, but it happens. You're not going to find anything by digging through records and harassing staff. Someone opened his coffin without my permission, I said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That was a procedural formality, nothing more. What procedure requires opening a sealed coffin? I don't know the details, but I'm sure there was a legitimate reason. Then tell me what it was. Nate, listen to me. You're grieving. You're looking for someone to blame, but you're going after good people who did everything they could. If you keep this up, you're going to embarrass yourself and hurt Grace in the process. Hurt Grace? She's mortified. She's been fielding calls from friends, colleagues, people asking why her brother is making a scene. You're making this harder for everyone. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to stay calm. Tell Grace I'm sorry, but I'm not stopping. You're going to regret this, Caleb said. Probably, but not as much as I'd regret doing nothing. I hung up. Back in my office, I sat at my desk and stared at the wall. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the hospital's regulatory filings again. Looked for any previous audits, compliance reviews, sanctions. Found nothing. Clean record. Spotless reputation. But spotless didn't mean honest. I spent the next 2 days at the lab focusing on work. Reviewed research protocols, mentored grad students, lectured on viral transmission dynamics. Normal academic tasks that kept my mind occupied. But every evening, I went home and updated my spreadsheet. Added Julia's findings, documented Caleb's call, built a timeline that was becoming increasingly clear. On Thursday afternoon, Julia called. I've filed the complaint, she said. The state health department confirmed receipt. They'll begin their audit within 2 weeks. What happens now? We wait. The hospital will be notified tomorrow. They'll have 10 days to submit a preliminary response. Then the auditors will conduct on-site reviews, interview staff, and examine records. How long until we get results? 4 to 6 weeks, maybe longer if they find significant issues. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. 4 to 6 weeks. I could wait that long. I had to. The hospital's response came faster than expected. 3 days after Julia filed the complaint, I received a formal letter from St. Augustine's legal department. It was polite but firm. They acknowledged the complaint, stated their commitment to full cooperation with the state audit, and assured me that all care provided to Evan had met the highest standards. The letter was signed by someone named Thomas Kellerman, general counsel. I read it twice, then forwarded it to Julia. She called me an hour later. This is standard. They're protecting themselves, but the wording is defensive. They're worried. Good, I said. There's something else, she added. I've been reviewing the procedural deviations I identified. One of them stands out. The delayed toxicology report. I've seen this pattern before in cases where hospitals are trying to manage liability. What do you mean? If there was something unexpected in the initial screening, they might delay the official report while they figure out how to frame it. It gives them time to prepare a narrative. You think they found something? I think it's possible. I hung up and sat at my desk, thinking. If the toxicology report had been delayed, what were they checking? What had shown up that required additional time? I pulled up my research database and started searching. Toxicology protocols, substance interactions, symptoms that matched Evan's presentation, altered mental status, rapid heart rate, multi-organ failure. Hours later, I found something. A case study from a medical journal. A 22-year-old patient presenting with similar symptoms. The cause had been an undetected bacterial infection complicated by an immune response to a recently administered vaccine. The infection had triggered septic shock. The patient had not survived. I read the case study 3 times. Then I opened Evan's medical records and searched for vaccination history. Found it. He'd received a routine booster 2 weeks before he collapsed. Standard procedure for college students. Meningococcal vaccine. I cross-referenced the symptoms, the timeline, the progression. It fit. Not perfectly, but close enough to warrant investigation. If Evan had an undetected infection at the time of vaccination, his immune system could have overreacted. It was rare, but not impossible. And if the hospital had missed it during his initial workup, they'd have liability. Significant liability. I called Julia. I think I found something, I said. I explained the case study, the vaccination timeline, the symptom match. She listened without interrupting. This is speculative, she said when I finished, but it's worth investigating. Do you have proof he had an underlying infection? No. The records don't show any infection screening beyond the standard admission panels. But if they didn't test for it, they wouldn't have found it. Which means they deviated from protocol, Julia said. If a patient presents with those symptoms post-vaccination, infection screening is mandatory. If they skipped it, that's negligence. Can you include this in the audit request? I can flag it for the auditors. They'll determine whether it warrants deeper investigation. Do it. I spent the next week in a state of controlled tension, continued my work at the lab, attended department meetings, published a paper on viral mutation rates, but every evening I went home and reviewed the case study, the records, the timeline. It was all there, the pieces, the pattern, the failure. On Friday afternoon, I received an email from the state health department. They were scheduling on-site interviews at the hospital. Staff who had been involved in Evan's care would be questioned, records would be audited. I was listed as a potential witness. I forwarded the email to Julia. She called me immediately. This is good. It means they're taking the complaint seriously. When they contact you for an interview, be honest. Answer their questions directly. Don't speculate, don't editorialize, just tell them what you know. I will. The interview request came 2 days later. A phone call from an investigator named Paul Hendricks. He was polite, professional, asked if I'd be available to meet the following week. I agreed. He gave me a date and time. Tuesday afternoon, at a state office building downtown. That weekend, I didn't leave the house. I reviewed every document, every note, every piece of evidence I'd compiled. I rehearsed answers to potential questions. I prepared for every angle they might take. On Monday, Grace called. Nate, please stop this. I can't. Caleb's furious. He says you're destroying the hospital's reputation. They didn't do their jobs. That's the problem. You don't know that. You're just guessing. I'm not guessing. I'm following evidence. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, What if you're wrong? Then I'll accept that. But I don't think I'm wrong. She hung up without saying goodbye. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Thought about Evan, about the last time I'd seen him alive, machines breathing for him, monitors beeping steadily. They'd known something was wrong. They'd known, and they'd hidden it. And now I was going to prove it. The state office building was downtown, a gray concrete structure that looked like it had been built in the 70s. I arrived 10 minutes early, checked in at the security desk, took the elevator to the 4th floor. Paul Hendricks met me in a small conference room. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, wearing a suit that looked slightly too big. He shook my hand and gestured to a chair. Thank you for coming, Dr. Jossman, he said. This shouldn't take long. I just need to ask you some questions about your son's care. Of course. He opened a folder and pulled out a recording device. Do you consent to this conversation being recorded? Yes. He pressed a button. A red light blinked. Please state your name for the record. Nate Jossman. He walked me through the basics, Evan's admission, his symptoms, the timeline of his deterioration. I answered carefully, precisely, sticking to facts. Then he asked about the tests I'd requested. You mentioned to hospital staff that you wanted additional testing. Can you specify what tests and why? I requested a comprehensive infectious disease panel, autoimmune markers, viral load screening. I'm a virologist. I know what causes sudden multi-organ failure in young adults. It's usually infection, toxin, or immune dysfunction. I wanted to rule out all three. Were those tests conducted? Not to my knowledge. The records I received don't include them. Hendricks made a note. Did the hospital explain why they weren't conducted? They said they'd done everything appropriate, that additional testing wasn't indicated. But you disagreed? Yes. Given Evan's presentation and recent vaccination history, infection screening was mandatory. Hendricks looked up. Recent vaccination history. He'd received a meningococcal booster 2 weeks before he collapsed. Post-vaccination infection is rare, but it's a known risk. It should have been investigated. Hendricks made another note. Did you mention this to hospital staff? Not initially. I didn't make the connection until later. When? After I received his medical records and started cross-referencing his symptoms with known case studies. Hendricks flipped through his notes. You mentioned in your complaint that your son's coffin was opened without your consent. Can you elaborate? I told him about Father Hart's warning, the hospital personnel with documentation, the lack of explanation. Hendricks was quiet for a moment. We'll investigate that as part of the audit. If it happened without proper authorization, it's a serious violation. Good. He closed his folder. That's all I need for now. We'll be conducting on-site reviews at the hospital over the next few weeks. If we need additional information, we'll contact you. Thank you. I left the building and drove back to the university. My phone rang as I parked. Julia. How did it go? He seemed thorough, asked about the tests I'd requested, the vaccination timeline, the coffin. Good, that means they're taking it seriously. What happens next? We wait. The auditors will complete their review, compile findings, and issue a report. If they confirm violations, the hospital will face sanctions. How long? 3 to 4 weeks? I hung up and sat in my car. 3 to 4 weeks. I could wait. 2 days later, I received another email from the state health department. They'd scheduled a preliminary review meeting. Hospital administrators would be present, so would the auditors. I was invited to attend. The meeting was set for the following Thursday. Hospital boardroom, 2 p.m. I forwarded the email to Julia. She called immediately. This is unusual. They don't normally include complainants in preliminary reviews. What does it mean? It means they found something, and they want you there when they present it. Thursday arrived. I dressed carefully. Suit and tie, professional, controlled. I drove to the hospital and parked in the visitor lot. Inside, I took the elevator to the 5th floor. The boardroom was at the end of a long hallway. Large double doors, polished wood. I pushed through and found myself in a room filled with people. Marlon Price sat at the head of the table. Beside him, Thomas Kellerman, the hospital's lawyer. Irene Voss was there, seated near the middle. Paul Hendricks and another investigator I didn't recognize sat opposite them. And at the far end, Caleb Morris. He looked at me as I entered. His expression was cold, controlled. I took a seat near the door. Paul Hendricks stood. Thank you all for coming, he said. We've completed our preliminary audit of the care provided to Evan Jossman. I'm here to present our findings. Paul Hendricks opened a folder and pulled out a stack of documents. He distributed copies around the table. I took mine and scanned the first page. Bold letters at the top. Preliminary audit findings. Patient E. Jossman. Our review identified multiple procedural deviations, Hendricks began. First, the delayed toxicology screening. Standard protocol requires results within 6 hours for critical patients. In this case, results were delayed 48 hours. Second, the absence of comprehensive infection screening despite clear indicators. The patient presented with post-vaccination symptoms consistent with septic response. No bacterial cultures were ordered. Marlon Price shifted in his seat. Those decisions were made by the attending physician based on clinical judgment. Clinical judgment doesn't override mandatory protocols, Hendricks said. Third, the authorization to open the sealed coffin. We found documentation signed by Mr. Price authorizing post-mortem tissue collection without next of kin consent. The room went silent. I stared at Marlon. You authorized it? He didn't look at me. It was necessary to complete the mortality review. Without telling me? The review required additional samples. It was procedural. It was illegal, Hendricks said. Post-mortem procedures require explicit family consent unless there's a court order or public health emergency. Neither applied here. Thomas Kellerman leaned forward. Mr. Price acted within his administrative authority. No, Hendricks said. He didn't, and that's not the only issue. He pulled out another document. We found evidence that infection screening was ordered initially, but then canceled. The cancellation was authorized by Mr. Price 3 hours after the patient was admitted. I felt my chest tighten. You canceled the tests? Marlon's jaw clenched. The attending physician and I discussed the case. We determined additional testing wasn't cost-effective given the prognosis. Cost-effective? I said, my voice rising. My son was 19 years old. Dr. Jossman, Hendricks said quietly. Please. I forced myself to sit back. Hendricks continued. The canceled tests would have identified a bacterial infection. Treatment could have been initiated. The outcome might have been different. Marlon stood abruptly. This is speculation. You can't know that treatment would have worked. We know it wasn't attempted, Hendricks said, and we know why. Mr. Price's authorization notes cite budget constraints and low probability of recovery. He made a financial decision, not a medical one. Caleb spoke for the first time. Marlon was managing resources responsibly. Hospitals can't run every test for every patient. They can when it's medically indicated, Hendricks said, and they must when it's mandatory protocol. Irene Voss spoke, her voice steady. I reviewed the same files. The deviations are clear. Mr. Price bypassed multiple safeguards. Marlin turned to her. You're part of this hospital. You answer to me. I answer to compliance standards, she said. Not to you. Hendricks pulled out a final document. Based on these findings, the State Health Department is recommending immediate administrative leave for Mr. Price pending further investigation. We're also recommending a full operational audit of St. Augustine Hospital. Thomas Kellerman stood. We'll contest this. That's your right, Hendricks said. But the findings stand. Caleb slammed his hand on the table. This is absurd. You're destroying this institution over one case. One case where protocols were deliberately violated, Hendricks said. One case where a patient received substandard care because of administrative interference. That's not absurd. That's criminal negligence. Marlin's face went pale. I was protecting the hospital's interests. You were protecting your budget, I said, standing. And my son is gone because of it? The room fell silent. Everyone stared at me. I looked at Marlin, then at Caleb. You knew, I said to Caleb. You called Marlin after Evan was admitted. You told him to manage it quietly, to avoid scrutiny. Caleb's expression didn't change. That's a lie. Is it? I pulled out my phone and opened an email. I requested call logs from the hospital. Irene provided them. You called Marlin's direct line 6 hours after Evan was admitted. The call lasted 11 minutes. Caleb stood slowly. That proves nothing. It proves you were involved, I said. And when the full investigation is complete, it'll prove you influenced the decisions that ended my son's life. Hendricks stepped forward. Mr. Morris, you'll be contacted for questioning as part of the extended investigation. Caleb looked at Marlin, then at me. His face was rigid, controlled, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear. He turned and walked out without another word. Marlin remained standing, his hands gripping the back of his chair. I did what I thought was right. You did what was cheap, I said. Hendricks closed his folder. This meeting is concluded. Mr. Price, you'll receive formal notification of your suspension within 24 hours. Dr. Jossman, thank you for your cooperation. I nodded and left the boardroom. In the hallway, Irene caught up with me. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I should have flagged this sooner. You did what you could. It wasn't enough. I looked at her. It is now. I walked out of the hospital into the afternoon sunlight. My phone buzzed. A text from Julia. I heard. You did it? I stared at the message, then looked back at the hospital entrance. People walked in and out. Normal people with normal problems. But inside, the system that had failed my son was finally being held accountable. I got in my car and drove away.